The night is a living creature in Colombia. It moves through the streets with invisible fingers, stroking the windows of houses, whispering in the leaves of trees, wrapping itself around the wheels of cars that cut through its silence. Taxi drivers know this creature better than anyone. They are its companions, its witnesses, and sometimes its victims. While the rest of the world sleeps, taxi drivers roam cities and rural roads alike, carrying strangers, stories, and secrets. And many of those secrets are so terrifying, so unexplainable, that the men who live them can never drive the same way again. The first of these stories belongs to Diego, a driver from Bogotá. He had been working taxis for nearly 15 years, often during the late shift, because that's when business was best. Bogotá at night is a city of contrasts. You can drive down avenues blazing with neon lights and music pouring out of bars, then turn into a narrow street where silence feels heavier than stone. Diego knew those streets well, and he thought nothing could surprise him anymore. Until one night changed everything. It was a rainy evening, the kind where the city seemed to blur behind curtains of water. Diego parked under a street lamp near an old cemetery, waiting for his next passenger. He saw her through the foggy windshield, a woman in a long black coat, her hair plastered against her pale face. She raised her hand weakly, and Diego, ever the professional, drove forward and unlocked the back door. She slipped inside without a word, dripping rainwater onto the seat. "Where to?" Diego asked. Her voice was soft, almost too soft to hear, as she gave him an address in La Candelaria, one of Bogotá's oldest neighborhoods. He nodded and started driving. The rain pounded against the roof, drowning out the hum of the engine. Diego tried making small talk, but she didn't respond. She only stared out the window, her reflection in the glass distorted by rivulets of rain. Halfway through the ride, Diego noticed the air inside the taxi growing colder. At first, he thought it was the rain cooling the metal frame, but soon he could see his breath clouding the mirror. The woman hadn't moved. Her silence pressed down on him like a weight. He turned to glance at her directly, but what he saw made his heart leap into his throat. Her seat was empty. Diego slammed the brakes in the middle of the road, his breath ragged. He looked again. No one was there. The puddle on the seat where the rainwater had soaked in was still fresh, but the woman was gone. He sat frozen for several minutes, too terrified to move. Finally, he drove straight home, refusing to pick up another passenger that night. Days later, when he described the experience to another driver, the man only shook his head and whispered, "You saw her, didn't you? The woman from the cemetery. She never makes it to her destination." The second story comes from Andrés, a driver in Medellin. If Bogotá's nights are heavy with fog and rain, Medellin's are sharp with shadows. The city sits in a valley, and its winding roads climb into the mountains like veins. Andrés preferred driving in the lower part of the city, where the lights were bright. But one night, a passenger asked him to go up into the hills, and Andrés, reluctant but unwilling to lose money, agreed. The passenger was a man in his 50s, dressed formally, as though he had just left a business meeting. His demeanor was polite, almost too polite, and he gave Andrés precise instructions, guiding him deeper into the mountain roads. The higher they climbed, the darker it became. Streetlights vanished, houses grew sparse. Finally, Andrés asked, "Señor, where exactly are we going?" The man only replied, "Almost there." After nearly 40 minutes of driving, they reached a dead-end road overlooking the city below. The man leaned forward, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Stop here." Andrés turned to face him, and froze. The back seat was empty. His heart thundered in his chest. He swore he could still hear breathing, but there was no one there. Terrified, Andrés spun the taxi around and sped back down the mountain. He told himself it was exhaustion, maybe even a hallucination. But the next morning, when he looked at the back seat, he found something that still makes his hands tremble when he recalls it. The faint imprint of a man's body pressed into the fabric, as though someone had been sitting there all night. Not all stories take place in the cities. In the rural towns of Colombia, where the nights are darker and silence heavier, taxi drivers speak of things far stranger than vanishing passengers. One of the most chilling tales comes from Javier, who drove a taxi route connecting small towns in the department of Santander. Javier's shift often forced him to travel long stretches of road surrounded by forest and farmland. On one particular night, he was driving along a deserted highway when he saw a figure ahead. It looked like a child, standing in the middle of the road, motionless. Concerned, Javier slowed down and rolled down his window. "Are you lost?" he called out. The child didn't answer. Instead, it tilted its head at an unnatural angle, staring at him with eyes that reflected the headlights like an animal's. Javier's stomach dropped. He pressed his foot on the gas, swerving to avoid the child, his pulse racing. But when he looked into the rearview mirror, the figure was sitting in the back seat, grinning with teeth far too sharp to be human. Javier screamed, slamming the brakes, spinning the car to the side of the road. He jumped out, heart pounding, and opened the back door. Empty. The seat was cold, as though someone, or something, had just been there. Javier refused to drive that route again. Other drivers whispered about los niños de la carretera, ghostly children who lured cars into accidents. Some said they were spirits of children who had died in crashes years before. Others claimed they weren't children at all, but something older, darker, wearing a child's shape like a mask. The last story comes from Mauricio, a driver in Cali. His tale is different, not just because of what he saw, but because of what followed him after. It was around 3 a.m. when Mauricio picked up a young woman outside a nightclub. She seemed normal at first, smiling faintly, giving him an address across town. But as they drove, Mauricio noticed her reflection in the mirror didn't match her movements. When she turned her head to look out the window, her reflection kept staring straight ahead. His skin prickled, but he said nothing, afraid of sounding foolish. When they arrived, the woman leaned forward, her hair brushing against his shoulder, and whispered, "Thank you for the ride." Then she vanished. The seat was empty. The door never opened. Mauricio sat in stunned silence, gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The next day, when he checked his taxi in the daylight, he found something scratched into the inside of the rear door. 3 deep marks, like claw marks, carved into the metal. He had no explanation, and for weeks afterward, he felt watched whenever he drove at night, as though someone was sitting silently in the back seat, waiting. The night pressed heavier against the walls of the old hotel, its silence broken only by the faint crackle of the antique lamps that still clung to life. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long, as if the building itself wanted to trap whoever dared to walk its hallways. By this time, most of the guests had already retreated into their rooms, hoping that sleep would save them from the uneasy atmosphere that lingered in every corner. But not everyone was so fortunate. One of the guests, a man traveling for work, had returned late after a long day of meetings. He had chosen the hotel because of its location and its surprisingly cheap price for the area. At first, the dusty carpets and faded wallpaper didn't bother him. But the deeper he walked through its hallways, the more he noticed the air seemed thick, heavy, almost suffocating. When he finally entered his room, he dropped his suitcase onto the creaky wooden floor. Everything looked ordinary, but ordinary in this hotel carried a strange weight. The bed seemed untouched, almost too perfectly made, and the curtains swayed slightly even though the window was firmly shut. He ignored the detail, brushed his teeth, and laid down. But the moment his head touched the pillow, he felt as if the mattress sank deeper than it should, as if someone else was lying there with him, invisible, pressing against the sheets. He tried to dismiss the thought, telling himself it was exhaustion. Closing his eyes, he willed himself to sleep. Minutes passed. Then, a faint whisper emerged from the corner of the room. At first, it was so soft he thought it might have been his imagination. But soon, the sound became clear. A woman's voice, low and broken, repeating words he couldn't fully understand. His blood froze when he realized the whispers weren't coming from outside the room. They were coming from inside the wardrobe. Slowly, with trembling hands, he sat up. The wardrobe stood tall against the wall, its wooden doors slightly ajar. The voice continued, a whisper turning into a desperate sob. His heart pounded so violently it drowned every rational thought, but curiosity forced him to move closer. He reached for the wardrobe handle, his breath shaking. The second he touched it, the whisper stopped. Silence. A silence so heavy that it felt alive. He yanked the door open, but nothing was there, just the empty, dusty interior. Relief washed over him, followed by embarrassment. He laughed nervously, muttering to himself that he was simply too tired. He shut the door, locked it, and returned to bed. But as he pulled the blanket over himself, something shifted in the mattress. This time, it wasn't subtle. The weight pressed down hard, as if someone sat right beside him. He froze. His breathing stopped, his eyes staring into the darkness. Then, in the faint glow of the streetlight sneaking through the curtains, he saw it, an impression forming on the sheets. The unmistakable outline of a body, lying down right next to him. He bolted upright, his scream trapped in his throat. The impression remained for a few seconds before slowly fading, as if whatever was there had sunk deeper into the mattress. He didn't wait another moment. Grabbing his suitcase, he stumbled out of the room and down the hallway. But the hotel wasn't finished with him. The corridor stretched longer than before, endlessly repeating itself. No matter how many steps he took, the flickering lamp ahead never got closer. Behind him, the sound of footsteps echoed, slow and deliberate, matching his pace. He dared to look back. Nothing. But the footsteps grew louder, closer, until they seemed to breathe down his neck. He broke into a run, his heartbeat echoing louder than the footsteps, his chest burning with fear. Then, suddenly, he reached the lobby. The desk was empty, the receptionist gone. The old grandfather clock ticked loudly, each strike echoing like a hammer in his skull. He rushed to the exit, but when he pulled the doors, they wouldn't budge. He pulled harder, desperate, but the glass reflected something he wished he hadn't seen. Behind him, in the reflection, stood a pale figure. A woman with hollow eyes, her hair dripping wet as if she had just climbed from a grave, her lips moving silently. He spun around. Nothing. But when he looked back at the glass, she was closer. Her hands pressed against the other side of the reflection, her mouth moving faster, whispering those same broken words from the wardrobe. His knees gave out. The last thing he remembered before everything went black was the sound of the clock striking midnight and the whisper now clear. Stay. Forever. The city streets were quiet, almost deceptively so, when Javier climbed into his taxi after a shift. The air smelled of rain and asphalt, a scent so ordinary it made the terror of the previous nights feel like a distant dream. But Javier knew better. He had learned that in Colombia, the ordinary is only a mask. Beneath it, shadows move, watching, waiting. That night, his first passenger appeared just as he was turning onto the main avenue. A man dressed in a heavy coat despite the warm evening gestured silently from the curb. Javier pulled over and opened the door. The man climbed in, his eyes dark and unreadable. He gave Javier a single instruction. Take me to the old bridge on the outskirts of the city. The ride began normally, with the usual hum of tires on asphalt and the occasional sound of distant traffic. But as they approached the outskirts, the atmosphere shifted. Streetlights grew sparse, their glow flickering. Trees loomed over the road, their branches scratching against the car like skeletal fingers. Javier's passenger remained silent, staring straight ahead, his presence somehow heavier than the seat itself. Suddenly, Javier saw movement in the rearview mirror. Shadows, dark, humanoid shapes, raced alongside the car. They moved unnaturally, like distorted reflections of real people. Javier's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "What are those?" he whispered. But the man didn't answer. He only leaned forward, his breath cold on Javier's neck, whispering a single word. "Drive." The shadows grew closer, their shapes twisting with each step, limbs elongating, faces contorted. Javier pressed harder on the gas, heart hammering. The world outside seemed to warp, the asphalt bent under the headlights, stretching into impossible curves. The shadows matched every turn, every swerve. He dared not slow down. Then, the car jolted violently. Javier glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. The man in the back seat was gone. The shadows, too, had vanished. All that remained was the deafening silence of the empty road. Javier exhaled shakily, unsure if relief or terror should come first. But when he looked at the seat, the fabric was indented. Fresh imprints of hands, feet, a body. Someone, or something, had been there. As he reached the old bridge, Javier dared to stop the car, hoping the nightmare was over. The street was empty, the moon casting a pale glow over the cracked concrete. He stepped out, heart pounding, and the wind carried a whisper. A soft, almost imperceptible voice calling his name. Javier's blood ran cold. He spun around. Nothing. But in the reflection of the water beneath the bridge, he saw them. Dozens of shadowy figures, faces twisted in silent screams, reaching up toward him. Javier jumped back into his taxi, slamming the door. He didn't dare look in the rearview mirror again. His foot never left the accelerator until he was back in the safety of the city lights, breathing hard, drenched in sweat. That night, he swore he would never drive after midnight again. Yet in his dreams, he still hears the whisper, "Drive, forever." Meanwhile, in Cartagena, another driver named Carlos faced a terror that was both more subtle and more sinister. It was late, around 2 a.m, and the streets were empty. Carlos had just finished dropping off a passenger when a new one appeared. A young woman standing under a dim streetlight. She wore a white dress, damp from the evening dew, and her hair fell over her face like a veil. She climbed into the back seat and said nothing, only pointing ahead, toward the old colonial district. As they drove, Carlos noticed the air inside the taxi growing colder with every block. The windows fogged over despite the warm night. He tried speaking to her, but she didn't respond. Then he saw it. Her reflection in the rearview mirror didn't match her movements. When she turned her head toward the window, the reflection remained fixed, staring directly at him. Carlos's heart raced. He felt the hairs on his neck stand on end. He glanced at the rear seat, but it was empty. Yet the feeling of weight, of presence, pressed down as if someone had been leaning over him. The city streets seemed to elongate unnaturally, stretching into corridors of shadows. Every turn he made brought the sense that something was following, just out of sight, watching his every move. By the time they reached the old district, the woman was gone. The back seat, however, was damp, as though soaked in a liquid that wasn't water. Trembling, Carlos drove off, never looking back. Later, he learned from a local that the district had a tragic history. A series of mysterious drownings decades ago, mostly of young women in white dresses. Some say their spirits still wander, searching for a ride back to the living world. In Medellin, Diego's story mirrored the terror of the other drivers, but added a twist that made him question reality itself. He was driving a night shift through the city's winding roads when a man waved him down, soaked from the sudden rainstorm. The man entered without a word, providing only a street name deep in the hills. Diego obeyed, navigating narrow streets lit by flickering streetlights. Halfway there, Diego noticed that the man's appearance began to change. His body seemed transparent, his skin flickering like static on an old television screen. Diego blinked, thinking exhaustion had distorted his vision. But when he looked again, the man's face was grotesque, stretched unnaturally, eyes dark and empty. The seatbelt snapped against his arm, yet no physical form restrained him. Fear gripped him completely. He tried to turn around, to escape, but the streets twisted under his wheels, bending impossibly, leading him in circles. Every time he glanced in the mirror, the man's eyes followed him, burning into his soul. Finally, Diego took the only option left. He accelerated straight toward the city, ignoring turns, ignoring the shrieking of brakes, until the man was gone, leaving only a lingering chill in the cab. And in Cali, Mauricio's tale reached its peak of horror. He had picked up a man who claimed he needed a ride to a hospital on the outskirts of town. The passenger was polite, quiet, but there was a strange glint in his eyes. Halfway through the drive, Mauricio realized the passenger wasn't giving directions anymore. He wasn't speaking at all. Instead, the man's eyes followed something in the distance, something Mauricio couldn't see. Suddenly, the taxi lights flickered. The road ahead became obscured by a dense black fog, and Mauricio felt the car's brakes fail. The engine roared, tires spinning on invisible gravel. Behind him, he heard whispers, dozens of voices calling his name, screaming, crying. Panicking, he pressed the horn. The fog parted momentarily, and he glimpsed figures rising from the darkness. Pale, twisted shapes, some crawling, some standing, all reaching toward him. Mauricio floored the accelerator, pushing past the fog, past the shadows. When the lights of the city finally reappeared, he dared a glance back. The road behind him was empty, silent. The man had vanished. But Mauricio felt it in his chest. The presence of something ancient, something that would never forget him, waiting for the next ride, the next shift, the next unsuspecting driver. These stories, whispered among taxi drivers across Colombia, share a common thread. Whether in Bogotá, Medellín, Cartagena, or Cali, the dead, the spirits, the shadows, they do not rest. They travel with the night, slipping into cars, vanishing passengers, and impossible figures that defy explanation. Drivers speak of them quietly, over cups of coffee during breaks, passing warnings that others sometimes ignore. Yet for those who have lived it, the experience is etched forever in memory, a chilling reminder that the streets we traverse every day may be more alive than we dare to believe. And perhaps that is the truest terror, the understanding that the next time you step into a taxi in Colombia, the person sitting beside you or the shadow in the back seat might not belong to this world. The night is patient, and it waits, always,